But there's another reason that the Federal Reserve is basically unconstitutional. It's a cartel structure. You have 12 regional banks, and on top of that is the all-seeing eye of the pyramid, the Board of Governors, and the Federal Open Market Committee. And then down below in the pyramid, you have all of the member banks, the private member banks. Right. Now, if you look at that structure with a constitutional eye, if you will, you say, where have I seen this before? This is the structure that Roosevelt created in 1933 in his first attempt to overcome the Depression. It was called the National Industrial Recovery Act. They created one of those little pyramids in every major industry, for steel, for coal, right? They had one for poultry, all right? And there was a famous case, Schechter versus United States, called the sick chicken case, because it involved the live poultry code, if you can imagine this. In that industry, a code was created by the participants, by the private parties. And it could be amended or corrected by the National Recovery Administration, but basically it was created by the private parties. And under that code, a chicken seller could not sell one chicken out of a coop. He had to sell both chickens in the coop. Customer comes in and says, well, I don't like that chicken. It looks sick to me. I only want the one chicken. All right, sold him the one chicken. That was a criminal violation of the code, all right? This goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States in the Schechter case. Unanimously, they declared that structure unconstitutional because it amounted to a delegation of legislative authority to private parties. That is the exact structure of the Federal Reserve System. It's a delegation of some kind of monetary authority to private parties, these 12 regional banks, and of course they do have the Board of Governors at the top, but so did the National Industrial Recovery Act. It had the National Recovery Administration, was the little agency on the top overseeing everything they wanted. Now, you ask the question, well, why is the Federal Reserve still here? Because that statute was enacted in 1913, and it wasn't part of the National Industrial Recovery Act. And nobody ever succeeded in bringing a case to the Supreme Court to challenge the Federal Reserve System on the same basis on which the National Industrial Recovery Act was declared unconstitutional. So if you look at this system,
why not?
It just didn't happen.
And when Roosevelt confiscated the gold, which is Article 1, Section 8, and you correct me in Article and Section 10, there were people that sued because he was effectively taking away the money of the Constitution, and the Supreme Court wouldn't take the case.
Oh, that one is interesting because you can find the party who brought the cases to them. So it isn't a question of, well, why didn't it happen? It did happen, and they refused to hear those cases. So people who look at this gold seizure question say, well, they might do this again on the precedent of the 30s. First question you have to ask is, well, what precedent? This never came before the Supreme Court of the United States. So you have a system that's economically unstable. You have a system that is essentially politically corrupt because of the incestuous relationship of the Treasury to the banks. You have a system in which a very small number of people, potentially one, the chairman of the Board of Governors, can have tremendous say over all of these economic variables, interest rates, the amount of currency that's put out, the amount of public debt that's going to be assumed.
Worldwide, by the way.
Worldwide now, right? Because it functions essentially as a de facto world central bank.
It's an unelected official.
And that's right. These people, well, they're appointed, but they're certainly not elected. They have no responsibility to Congress. They come and tell Congress what they're going to do. Congress doesn't tell them what they should do. Right?
They can't be fired.
Right.
Yeah. Well, they could be, I suppose they could be impeached. I mean, there's some way to get rid of them. But technically speaking, the way it actually works is they're in there for essentially as long as that term, and then another term or whatever. How many terms did Greenspan serve?
Unless they commit a crime.
Yeah.
I think 18 years or so, maybe 19.
Yeah,
but
sorry. So let's talk a bit about how this private banking system effectively takes money from the U.S. taxpayer.
Well, how it takes money from everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah. I mean, the basic problem with creation of currency out of nothing is that somebody gets that currency initially. It might be the U.S. Treasury to spend on whatever they're going to spend it on, $100 toilet seats for the Army, whatever it is. Or it might be some industrial concern. It might be somebody in the stock market, whatever. They expend that money when the price level is here.
The banks.
The client of the bank, right? The bank is generating this, giving it to the client. The client goes into the marketplace and buys goods and services, stocks, whatever it is, at a certain price level. Now that money circulates into the economy, percolates down through the economy, all sorts of transactions go on. And the market wakes up and says, wait a minute, there's more money now than there was then. Prices start to change. Going up, some instances going down. The effect is that real wealth is transferred from somewhere downstream to these people who are the initial recipients of the money.
So mostly the end consumer is, the saver is paying for the...
Yeah, somebody down there finds his cost of living going up faster than his wages, his real standard of living goes down, he has a real loss of wealth, and that wealth is transferred up the line eventually, or actually initially, to these people here. So if the government is doing this, if the government is the recipient, you can call this hidden taxation. If the private industry is doing it, you can call it forced savings, because those people out there in the marketplace are losing some amount of their real wealth, and it's going into this concern. Their problem is they never get it back, and neither does the taxpayer ever get it back.
And just as a point, because every week, you will see a minimum of 2 articles in the New York Times, especially in the editorial section, that critiques income inequality. I.e., they're complaining about capitalism, they want to go to Marxism, which is egalitarianism. So, in this case, if you ask this question, when Nixon went off the gold standard, just to take a period where there was no gold backing, which is, Edwin said, August 1971, but if you take the CPI, which is the government number, which is understated, but let's use their number, from 1971 to March, I didn't post April, the compounded increase in the CPI is 4.26% a year compounded. Now, you show me a worker who can increase his wages 4.26% a year after taxes. Taxes have gone into a worker that makes $50,000 a year is in the 25% bracket. So he really is making $37,000. Now you take 4.26% a year compounded. That's why there is income inequality. That's why the middle class is not getting anywhere. It's inflation, but you never hear a liberal or a conservative economist ever bring that point up. They blame income inequality on other things, CEOs making too much money, etc. But they never bring up the Fed.
And again, that's because some people get the money first, they spend it first, and other people get it last, and by then the prices have already gone up.
It's a racket. Basically, it's a racket. And somebody's benefiting from this, and they can see the immediate benefit, and the losses are spread out over millions and tens of millions of people who have no idea what's happening to them.
And you talked about Marxism and socialism a bit, but let's maybe go back to the initial doctrine of communism, which has a central bank as one of its major tenets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. A monopoly.
Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I should think that the communists wanted that for 2 reasons. Number one, because they wanted to destroy the free market, so they wanted to control the monetary source. And then number 2, because of this wealth distribution effect. I mean, in the communist central bank, same thing would happen. They'd print the money, or they'd electronically generate it, and they'd spend it in some way in their planned economy, and the same results would accrue.
Yeah. In the 10 planks in the Communist Manifesto, number 5 was a monopoly held by the government of money and credit, printing money and credit. And that basically was to control the system because, again, they didn't want people making money in that system. Everybody had to make the same except the people in charge.
And now you don't have the government controlling it in the United States. Instead, you have private enterprises controlling it. Now, let's talk about the interest, because that's also another thing. Interest payments in the banking system. You talked about inflation. Interest is clearly another factor.
And what would be the question? I mean, true, but what specifically about interest?
So you create money from nothing, and then you charge interest on it.
Correct. Correct. And isn't it true, Edwin, I mean, just as a point of order, in 1884, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that the government could print money for any reason, if it wanted to, for emergencies. This comes from the Civil War, from the Currency Acts. So, in effect, if the government wanted to, according, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but if they wanted to, they could do it without the Federal Reserve. It's to give the Federal Reserve, the bankers, a partnership interest, and they get 6% of the profits that the Fed creates, and the government is 94, so they pay them a fee for running the system, but it basically is complicating it so that the average person can't see it, is my opinion. Plus, they want to get in big with the bankers who can give them donations and contributions for campaigns and free houses and whatever they can get without being noticed. So the key here is the interest rate is, if you're saying now interest rates, not the percentage the bankers get, but interest rates are another way of manipulating the system according to the desires of the people who are in charge.
And the real, what shall I say, winners in this system are not those 12 regional banks. They, to a large extent, are dummies. It's all of the member banks below that are using this pyramidal structure. They're lending money out and collecting interest. And they don't have to pay, other than their tax rate, they don't have to pay any of those returns over as a statutory matter to the U.S. Treasury.
Right, and then who benefits from that within these banks? I'm talking about now, especially the too big to fail banks.
Well, what's interesting about it is, even with his system, when they go beyond the limits of prudence, they come back to the government and say, well, now you've got to give us some kind of a bailout or a bail-in. Maybe we'll be seeing that too.
So
right?
It's not the shareholder.
The shareholder of
The private banks.
the shareholders, they benefit too.